Joseph had been unfairly put into prison. So the first verse of chapter 40 of Genesis. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why are your faces so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, "In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." "This is what it means," Joseph said to him. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. For I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorite interpretation, he said to Joseph, "I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top baskets were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh. But the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." "This is what it means," Joseph said. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat away your flesh." Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thank you, Sylvia.
Good morning. Michael, I'm sorry I haven't got my collar. I hope it's still okay. We live in a tough world, and many live in very difficult circumstances. Last Saturday night, a group of terrorists broke into a compound in Kabul, Afghanistan, and killed a German Christian worker and her guard, and kidnapped a Finnish lady, and today we still don't know whether she's alive or dead. In February, one of our workers in Malaysia was kidnapped publicly in the streets, and to this day his family don't know if he's alive or dead. One of the things we've discovered in world missions in the last years is we have to take seriously a theology of suffering. And one of the things in our protected world and environment is we struggle to deal with suffering and difficulty. And it's something that needs to be understood, and I think Joseph helps us to understand a little bit about that. How do we explain undeserved, unjust hardship and suffering? Whether it's an accident like Charles and Jane, whether it's an illness that just destroys or threatens somebody's life, whether it's somebody who's victimized at work, whether it's financial difficulty where folk had planned, taken precautions, and somebody just went awry, and life just doesn't, we don't know how it's all going to work out. Somehow we believe the gospel that Jesus has come to be with us, to give us life and life abundantly, to provide our needs, and somehow what we believe we were promised, what we've hoped for, doesn't match with our experience. And there are many people today who feel God has let them down. They're disappointed with God. They're not sure they can really trust His word because that's not been their experience. As we consider the life of Joseph, I think we find some answers to some of these issues. And as we see how he made sense of the events of his life that seemed to be meaningless and unfair, I hope we can also make sense of some of the issues of our lives. There's a great danger when we come to some of these characters in the Old Testament to just think of them as Disney characters. You know, they existed, but fictitious, some sort of, unreal aspects about their life. But this was a very real young boy, a 17-year-old boy, his father's favorite, maybe unwise in some of the ways he conducted himself with his brothers, told stories on them, sold as a slave to an Ishmaelite group of traders who were going to Egypt. I'm not sure if we don't think of the angst he went through when he was thrown into that system, where he heard some of his brothers saying, let's kill him, others defending him and saying, no, let's not. What went through this 17-year-old boy's head? And then when they haul him out and sell him as a slave, and he's carted off to Egypt, a privileged young man, suddenly now with nothing. Finally sold to Potiphar, who was the captain of the guard, one of Pharaoh's officials, and one of his responsibilities to oversee Pharaoh's prisoners. Joseph, very competent, and because of God's blessing on his life, experienced great favor, and everything he did was successful and effective, so that Potiphar didn't have to worry about anything in his household. It thrived under Joseph's management. But Joseph, being well built and handsome, which is a great advantage in some cases and a great disadvantage in others, soon Potiphar's wife took notice of him, tried to seduce him. Joseph refused. And on one occasion when they were alone in the home, she grabbed hold of his cloak and tried to force him into her bed. He fled, leaving his cloak behind. And when Potiphar came home that night, she accused Joseph of wanting to seduce and rape her. And without any question, Potiphar threw him into the prison. No questions asked, completely unjust. And we're told the Lord was with Joseph. How do we think Joseph felt? Do we think he felt like, the Lord's with me? This is good. I'm in a good place. God is with me. I don't think so. The Lord was with Joseph, and he continued to thrive. He was given responsibility to care for the other prisoners. He had favor with the chief prison warder. And he continued to use his gifts and his abilities and to serve the people in the prison. And then in chapter 40, we come to the situation where one day, two of the officials of Pharaoh displeased him. Now, we're dealing here with a culture that was an honor-shame culture. There's no such thing as right or wrong or anything else. The Pharaoh is just fed up with you, angry with you for something. and they're into prison. Probably his chief butler, the cupbearer, who had responsibilities over his household, and then the chief baker, who provided all the goodies for the feasts where he entertained guests. But they offended him, we don't know what it was, and they, like Joseph, were just thrown into prison. And Potiphar, because this was Potiphar's prison, personally assigned Joseph to care for them while in prison. So he still worked for Potiphar, but now in the prison over which Potiphar was responsible. And he went about caring for these two men. One day they have a dream, two of them, they have different dreams, but they don't have access to their normal resources. They don't have access to the court wise men who would have interpreted their dreams for them. So they're dejected. And Joseph says to them, "What's your problem?" And they say, "Well, we've had a dream, there's no one to interpret." And Joseph, again, quite openly says, the interpretation of dreams is actually God's business. It's got nothing to do with the people you have or particular people. It's God's business. And trust me, tell me your story. And so the cupbearer tells him his story, and the story is favorable. In 3 days, God will lift up your head, Pharaoh will lift up your head, restore you to your position. Please, when you get back to Pharaoh, draw attention to Pharaoh as to my case. And the baker, having heard, well, here this is a favorable interpretation of the dream, he says, will you also please interpret my dream? And his dream was a little bit different, where he said, not will Pharaoh lift up your head, but Pharaoh will lift off your head. And you in 3 days will be impaled, executed. And that's exactly what happened. And so the cupbearer is released. He goes back to Pharaoh's court, restored to this position of honor, and once reinstated, promptly forgets about Joseph. And in the next chapter, we're told for a further 2 years. Joseph in prison, young man, his whole life before him, and yet everything removed from him. How did he feel? What was he going through? He tells, the words he used are quite interesting. When he tells the cupbearer his case, he says, "I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews." This is verse 15. "And even here I've done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." And in the Hebrew, the word he says is, "I was stolen, I was kidnapped." There's a violence here in losing everything I have. A 17-year-old, handsome and privileged, the favorite son of a very wealthy and influential man, sold into slavery. He had everything going for him, but now that was all removed from him. All of that ripped away, stolen. And if we just think of, just because of the jealousy and frustration of others, he cannot appeal to anyone for justice. His boss is the owner of the prison. He runs the prison, and that's the guy who threw him in jail. Where does he go? Joseph, his life, what he experienced was unfair and unjust, and he had every reason to be upset and to question God's love and God's promises. Do we feel we have reason to complain today? If you just reflect over the last few days, have you muttered about something that's not going right? Why is this happening to me? Why is life so unfair? How can they do that to me? How can they say that about me? We're told the Lord was with him, and Andrew told us last week a little bit more about the significance of this was the covenant God. The name Yahweh was used. The covenant God of Israel was with Joseph. What good is that when you're sitting in prison and you've lost your family, you've lost your inheritance, you've lost any hope of your future that was secure? It doesn't seem that's ever going to happen again. You've lost favor with your boss because his wife lied about you. You've lost any freedom of normal life because you're in prison. And there just seems to be no justice, no court of appeal, nowhere to go with all of this. And yet we never hear of him complaining or blaming God. We never hear of him muttering. The only account we have is when he's appealing now to the cupbearer and saying, please, bring my case before Pharaoh. Here's a glimmer of hope for me. What is it about Joseph that gives him this ability, this perspective, to be able to maintain his faith, maintain his, seemed a good attitude, willingness to serve? He still trusted God to help him in the interpretation of dreams. He used his gifts. He was willing to witness to this God who had left him in the dungeon. And obviously, people appreciated him. He found favor. He continued to be a good testimony, as it were. The reality is, for Joseph, and it is for us, that you cannot, actually this chapter, you cannot make sense of this chapter if you just look at this chapter alone. It only makes sense in the context of the bigger picture, the fuller story, purposes of God. We cannot make sense of our life, current situation, our circumstances, what's happening to us now, outside of the context of God's wider purposes for our lives. I'm taking the liberty, Andrew said something about we've all heard Andrew Lloyd Webber, but he has one song, which you probably know, and I've asked Neville if he could just show us this video with the words of this song of Joseph's. Sorry? It's okay. Help is at hand. That's okay. Don't worry, Neville. We'll leave it there. Okay. It's okay. No problem. I'm sure you've heard this song where Joseph, in the Andrew Lloyd Webber Tim Rice production, he says, "Close every door to me, hide all the world from me, bar all the windows and shut out the light. Do what you want with me, hate me and laugh at me, darken my daytime and torture my night. If my life were important, I would ask, will I live or die? But I know the answers lie far from this world." The answers to the questions I'm asking are not in this world and are not in this context. Close every door to me, keep those I love from me. Children of Israel are never alone, for I know I shall find my own peace of mind, for I have been promised a land of my own. Joseph, and it's captured, I believe, by Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber, Joseph had a hope of the promise of God. He had had those dreams as a young boy. If you've got it there, we might as well hear it. Better than me just reading it. Okay, we got the words, not the sound. That's fine. You can just leave it. Thanks, Neville.
All the windows and shut out the light. Do what you want with me, hate me and laugh at me. Darken my daytime and torture my night. If my life were important, I would ask, will I live or die? But I know the answers lie far from this world. Close every door to me. Keep those I love from me. Children of Israel are never alone, for I know I shall find my own peace of mind, for I have been promised a land of my own. Give me a number instead of my name. Forget all about me and let me decay. I do not matter, I'm only one person. Destroy me completely, then throw me away. If my life were important, I would ask, will I live or die? But I know the answers lie far from this world. Close every door to me. Keep those I love from me. Children of Israel are never alone, for we know we shall find our own peace of mind, for we have been promised a land of
Joseph was literally forgotten about, and I wonder if sometimes we feel somehow God has forgotten about us. Remember me, O Lord, I think was words David often used in the Psalms. And yet, Joseph never felt forgotten. He felt his identity was in who God called him to be. And somehow he knew there was a hope. Even after he was released, you remember when he died, he said, when we finally get to this promised land, take my bones out of Egypt. And when the Israelites left Egypt, they carried Joseph's bones because he knew the promise of God for a promised land. The key, I believe, in understanding how Joseph handled this is probably found in Genesis 50, verse 20. And some lucky person is going to preach on this again at some stage in the next months. So I'm going to steal their thunder a bit, because actually you cannot make sense of chapter 40 without looking at this verse 20 in chapter 50, where Joseph's father dies and his brothers suddenly feel Joseph is now going to take revenge. Now that the protection of dad is gone, Joseph is going to take it out on us, and he's going to deal with us, he's going to destroy us. And these are the words of Joseph. He was distraught that they should even think that. But he said to them, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done and saving many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Isn't that mind-blowing? And if we just look at what's happening here, first of all he says, don't be afraid, am I in the place of God? One of the problems we struggle with is when we believe we're in a better position than God to decide what's right or wrong in my life. We're in a better position to decide what's just or unfair about what's going on in our circumstances. And we take the place of God as judge, as the wise person knowing what's happening, as the planner of what should happen in our lives. Joseph never assumed that position. I'm not God. Even in interpreting the dreams, he made it very clear, this is not me, this is only God who can do this. And so the first thing is, let's allow God to be God and not take his place, not try and sit on the throne of judgment, sit on the seat of power and control, but release that and let God be God. Am I in the place of God? No. He was trusting God to deal with the people, trusting God to deal with the circumstances, and allowing God to decide what's right. That's a massive, massive challenge for most of us. But the first key to deal with these things is let God be God and know that in his love and in his mercy, he holds all things in his hands and he is working out his purpose for our lives. The second thing is he says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. And so Joseph realized that the undercurrent of all that was going on was the plan and purpose of God. And even if it was human beings meddling, interfering, even intentionally being harmful, he knew that somehow this was in the hand of God. And God would never allow something to happen to him that would thwart the purpose of God. Not a matter of for his happiness. His happiness was not central. His satisfaction was not central. What was good for him was not central. But what was central to the whole story is God's intent, God's plan, and God's purpose. And if God had to hide him in prison, we don't know how long altogether, for over 2 years at least, if that was part of the purpose of God, well, let it be. If God had to keep Moses in the desert for 50 years, just looking after sheep, well, let it be. If God has to hide us, and we feel, what value is my life? What on earth could God possibly be using me for? God's intent will not be frustrated or thwarted by the circumstances or the people of our lives. And he was willing to trust God to work out his plan in his time, in his way. That's a massive challenge for us as well, isn't it? We live in a world where we're supposed to have control more and more about our life and circumstances. And then we discover that actually IT does have failures, as British Airways discovered, as the NHS discovered. And the things we put our trust in let us down. But God never will. But we've got to come to that place where we're willing to trust him. Joseph was still happy to serve, still willing to use his gifts, still willing to be the productive, fruitful person God had made him in the depth of the dungeon. And then he says, don't be afraid, verse 21 of chapter 50, I will provide for you and your children. Joseph took on the nature of mercy and grace. He did not seek justice. He did not seek revenge. He did not hold bitterness in his heart. He did not live with unforgiveness. He said, I will provide for you. And he showed to his brothers what God shows to us in Christ. Mercy, where we're not given what we do deserve, and grace, where we're given far more than we ever deserve. And the character of a person who's trusting God will be one of mercy and grace, where we are willing to give to others what they don't deserve. We are willing to forgive others of what they do deserve, because that is God's job, not ours, to judge and deal with them. Joseph never experienced justice. There was never retribution that we know of on Potiphar. There was never retribution on his brothers. God actually used Joseph to save them, to feed them, to protect them, to bless them. So let's come back to our own situation and just let's not take the place of God. Let God be God. Allow him to be the one who decides how it should be. Let's come to the place where we, with his help, say, Lord, I'm here for your purposes. Our suffering will never make sense if it's just about me or it's just about now. It will only make sense when it's used by God to impact other lives in some way. And it might only make sense many years from now. It might not make sense to us in our lifetime, but it will make sense in the purposes of God. And then let us seek with God's help to be like Christ, to show the mercy and the grace to others, even those who have persecuted us, those who've made our life hell. This is the lesson of Joseph, who lost everything and yet never lost everything God had given him. Let us pray. Lord, thank you for the example of this young man's life. But thank you above all, history records your faithfulness when even there was every reason for him to doubt it. History records your grace and mercy, not just on him, but even on those who did not deserve it. Help us not to despair, not to lose hope, not to lose faith, but in the midst of our struggles and difficulties, to allow you to be the God who loves us, who cares for us, who's working out his purposes. Help us to align ourselves to your purpose as best we can, even in the midst of our suffering, to show mercy and grace and love, that we may be a witness to your greatness and to your goodness. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.